What's up, y'all? Today we're making Khachapuri, the most fun way to consume copious amounts of bread and cheese with your friends. It's a Georgian classic that comes in many different varieties, and here's how I like to do it. First up, we gotta make the dough. It's really similar to pizza dough, and if you're looking for a shortcut, you could probably use the pre-made stuff from the supermarket. But anyways, to make it from scratch, it starts with 250 grams of flour. Bread flour or a higher protein all-purpose is probably best here. Next goes 5 grams of salt, 5 grams of instant yeast, and 8 grams of sugar. I like to give that a little whisk to combine, and then on to the wet stuff, which is going to consist of 150 grams of water and 15 grams of olive oil. You can definitely mix and knead this by hand, but today I'm going to use the stand mixer. I'll let that go on medium speed for around 5 to 7 minutes, stopping to scrape down the bowl and the dough hook as needed. What's more important than the time here is that you check the elasticity of the dough to see if you've worked it enough, and for that, I'm gonna do the classic window pane test. Just grab a corner of it, and if you can stretch it thin enough to see light through it without it tearing, you're good to go. This is looking good there, so now it's time to proof it. You could get another clean bowl out for this, but whatever, I'm just gonna use this one. I'm gonna put a little olive oil in there so that nothing sticks, and I'll make sure to spread it up the sides a bit, and then I'll gather my dough into a smooth little ball. Throw that in there, and then I'll cover it with a clean kitchen towel and set it aside for about 2 hours. 2 hours later, or 3 depending on when you can get to it, it's time to roll this out and shape the khachapuri. So I'm gonna dump my dough out onto a lightly floured sheet of parchment paper and get this into a roughly 12 by 16 inch rectangle. I like to start by using my hands to pat this out and stretch it as far as I can first, and then I'll switch over to the rolling pin to finish it off. You really don't need to be perfect here. I've seen people roll this into circles, ovals, rectangles, and the final shape always seems to come out basically the same. So any semi-regular shape is going to be something you can work with. So once you get it out to a good size, to shape this thing, you're going to take one of the edges and roll it tightly until it's about an inch in diameter, and then you're going to do the same thing with the opposite edge. Next, on the open ends, you're going to continue rolling your edges until they meet somewhere in the middle, at which point you can give them a little twist and a pinch to seal them together. This ring that we're creating around the perimeter of our dough is going to be our molten cheese barricade, so make sure everything is secure and not moving around too much, or else you could suffer the dreaded khachapuri blowout. We really want to make sure all the cheese stays inside our little bread boat, so take your time inspecting the edges if you need to. Once it looks good, I'm going to slide this, parchment paper and all, onto a baking sheet. This was the reason for the parchment in the first place. This thing would be infinitely more difficult to move without a sling of sorts. So now I'll cover that with the same towel from earlier, and I'll let it rise a second time for about 15 minutes, or however long it takes us to prepare the cheese. I've got 3 cheeses going into this today, and just a heads up, I'm gonna do it wrong, but I can explain. First up is gonna be some Monterey Jack. A good option here is full fat, low moisture mozzarella if you can find it, but the full fat stuff is notoriously hard to come by, and the low fat or part skim stuff just doesn't melt the same. So Monterey Jack, I think, is a pretty decent substitute. This was an 8-ounce block of cheese, so I'm just gonna eyeball about 3 or 4 ounces of that. I want a total of 8 ounces of cheese in the end. Next goes about 4 ounces of feta that I'm gonna crumble in. I think the finer you crumble this, the smoother everything is gonna be in the end, so if you wanted to take more time than me on this, I think that would be not a bad idea. And now for the last cheese today, it's gonna be 2 slices of white American. Alright, hear me out. The Monterey Jack and feta alone are fairly close to what you would get in this traditionally, and those result in a cheese texture that is super stringy when they're melted, kind of like a mozzarella stick. That's great when you're trying to go for those long, sexy cheese pulls, but the way we're going to be eating this is by dipping the bread into the cheese and scooping some of it up. The American, with all its emulsifiers, is gonna give this a slightly more saucy texture that I think is much more convenient when it comes to matters of dipping. So I'm adding it, but if you don't want to, you can leave it out and you'd be more correct than me. So a lot of recipes would stop here with just the cheese, but I like to also add some herbs and spices to mine. Just about anything you could think of is probably going to taste good here, but I'll keep mine pretty simple. I'm going to do a green onion that I'll slice up finely, and then a small bunch, maybe a couple tablespoons of parsley that I'm also going to chop up fairly finely. Most of that goes in, but I'll save a pinch or two of it for garnish later. Next, I'll give it a few good cranks of black pepper, and then some crushed red pepper. This thing is going to be so rich that I think the freshness of the herbs and some added spiciness really go a long way in making it not quite so heavy. Give that a good mix, making sure to break up any big chunks of anything that you find in there, and now it is time to stuff our bread boat. You can see there, it should be slightly puffier now than it was when we shaped it. All of our cheese mixture goes in, which seems insane, I know, but the amount I'm using here is actually somewhat conservative compared to what I've seen some people do. If it's piled up in the center a bit, that's okay. Once it starts melting, it's all gonna settle into there perfectly. So now, this is gonna go into an oven preheated to 450 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 minutes, at which point it should look something like this. Looks great, but we're not quite done yet because now we're going to take the back of a spoon and make a little well in the center of our cheese, or at least try to, it only sort of works. Anyways, once it looks like it could hold an egg, go ahead and crack one in there. Some people do just the yolk, but I think the whole egg works fine and I hate separating eggs. That's going to go back in the oven now for another 4 minutes, at which point it should look something like this. I know the egg doesn't look done yet, and it's not, but that's okay, because now I'll add a couple tablespoons of butter and work this whole thing over with a fork until it's all evenly combined. There's so much heat stored in that molten cheese that once we start mixing the egg in, it'll cook through no problem. So I like to do this until the butter is melted and I don't see any more streaks of egg, basically until it's looking as homogeneous as it's gonna get. Top it with the reserved parsley from earlier, and that's it. That's how I like to make khachapuri. This thing will very comfortably feed at least 3 people, and if you have any leftovers, they're surprisingly good the next day. It's in the same food family as things like fondue and Panera bread bowls, but way more delicious and fun in my opinion. So I hope you try it out soon. If you do, let me know in the comments how it goes. Thanks. Bye.